This is the second of two introductory classes in progressive alternatives. And this class will be divided into two quite different parts. In the first part, I want to return to some of the themes of the first class and develop them. Ideas about the goals of the left, the distinction between right and left, and the relation of the progressives to ideas about human nature. The second part will be much more technical, and I want to focus specifically on the promotion of the aims of equality traditionally associated with the left. As you will already have seen from the first class, I'm going to be arguing that equality should not be the supreme goal of the progressives, but I want then to make a further argument in the second part of this class about how the progressives should understand equality and what they can do about it. Now let me begin by going back to the idea of the world historical context of the present argument about right and left. I said last time that for the last 300 years, the world has been on fire. There has been a revolutionary project in the world. This revolutionary project is far from being the only project in the world, but I want to argue that it has been the commanding project. It has many enemies, but all of its enemies respond to it. The project from the outset has had two parts. It has had a political part, promising to lift from human life and from society the grid of entrenched social division and hierarchy. And it has been carried by the doctrines of liberalism, of socialism, and of democracy. And it has had a second part, a personalist part, promoting the message that the ordinary man and woman are not so ordinary after all, and projecting all over the world through popular culture and the romantic movement and the worldwide popular romanticism of music and of the soap operas, the sublime message that the ordinary human being is capable of some form of divinization and can increase his quota in the divine attribute of transcendence. Now, I said before, this agenda, this revolutionary agenda, is now in the paradoxical situation of being both strong and weak. It remains strong because despite everything, it continues to command the agenda. And all the other projects in the world, all its enemies respond to it. But at the same time, it is weak because we do not know what its next steps should be. On either the political side or the personalist side. And it dies if we cannot reimagine it. Like everything else in our experience, it's subject to the law of the spirit, which is that we can keep only what we renounce and reinvent. The focus of this course is on the political side of this agenda, the social side, and on its next steps. But of course, the political and personalist side are intimately connected, and some discussion of its character and of its relation to the political side will inevitably come into our arguments. Now you all know, we all know, that we are in what might be regarded as a counter-revolutionary interlude in this long revolutionary period in the history of humanity. By calling it a counter-revolutionary interlude, I mean to be hopeful, because I want this revolutionary process to continue. I want it to be reinvented. And I am determined that my ideas and deeds will not be shaped by the biases of the counter-revolutionary interlude. That is the context, the world historical context in which this argument occurs. After many centuries of ideological fervor, we're now in this period of stoppage. And have witnessed the ideological calamities of the 20th century and the consequences, the often dramatic and disastrous consequences of the attempt to break out and create a completely different form of social life. Now let me stop right there, the first step, and ask whether someone wants to make a remark at this point. Now let me come to the second part of this first half of the argument today and return to the characterization of the ideological debate, the conventional understanding of the ideological debate. I claimed last week that in the conventional understanding, the idea is that the progressives are the ones who emphasize as their commanding goal equality, against the background of the established institutional arrangements. And the conservatives, the right, are the ones who emphasize liberty, freedom as their supreme priority, against the same background of the established institutional arrangements. So the conventional ideological debate as it exists today is largely a contest between shallow equality and shallow freedom. If by shallowness we mean the acceptance, often the implicit acceptance, of the established institutional horizon. Now I want to say that this understanding of the conventional ideological debate makes little sense. Suppose we take first the idea of the progressives, and particularly the most influential form of contemporary progressivism, which is institutionally conservative social democracy. Preoccupied with taking certain things out of the market, preoccupied with decommodification, as it is sometimes called, to preserve the individual against the ravages of economic insecurity, as Franklin Roosevelt did with his New Deal in the United States, and as the European social democrats and social liberals continue to do later on. What doesn't make sense about this is that if the concern is that the production system and the market will render the individual insecure, if there'll be a storm coming from outside, from the economy, threatening the individual, which the state must then protect, why do they have so little to say about that storm? Why is so little of their activity, of their politics, of their ideology concerned with the genesis of the evils that they wish to protect the individual against? If, on the other hand, we look to the right, there's a similar puzzle. Why is it there are right-wing movements all over the world? Social democracy and social liberalism have its enemies, manifest in the European home ground of social democracy, as well as in other parts of the world. But in no place does the right seem to have a distinctive economic program, other than the program of expanding the range of the market economy as it is now organized. I said last time, the majority of people in the world could be characterized as belonging to a subjective petty bourgeoisie. They are not objectively members of a small business class, but their horizon of aspiration, their dreams are petty bourgeois. Why is it that the right in power, in no place in the world, has presented the project of a popular capitalism? A capitalism focused on the little guy, on the petty entrepreneur, on his dream of creating a world in which his ambition of agency can be realized. What the right has done in power is to focus on migration and on the restraint of migratory flows, and on the creation of an identity politics, not of the minorities, as the progressives have preferred, but of the majority, to preserve the national culture and the social identities that it promotes against all of its enemies. So if these are the goals of the left and of the right, as the conventional understanding of the ideological debate supposes, why does it produce so little by way of practical consequence in the world? The discourse seems to be alienated from its own practice. Now, what would be the alternative to this contest between shallow equality and shallow freedom, if the criterion of shallowness is indeed this acceptance of the established institutional assumptions? For the progressives, the alternative might be some form of deep equality, of commitment to a forced equality of outcome or of circumstance, rather than to the mere equality of opportunities and capabilities that has come to so little in the practical world. And this is what responds to the myth which has existed now for centuries in the West, of a mythical Sparta, of a mythical Rome, in which everyone is equally poor and frugal and austere. No one wants that. It seems that this dream of deep equality has no takers. So what would be the alternative? The alternative is what you could call deep freedom. Now, what does that, or what could it mean for us? Let's first remind ourselves of what it meant for the liberals and socialists of the 19th century. What it meant is that the main goal of the progressives should be the elevation of human life, of the human life of ordinary men and women to a higher level of intensity, of capability, of power. And the objection to inequality was completely subservient to that larger objective, to that larger goal. The objective, in other words, was not the humanization of society. The objective was the divinization of humanity. That was the objective of Abraham Lincoln, of Karl Marx, of John Stuart Mill, that the ordinary human being would be carried up to a higher level of power. And inequality was unacceptable only insofar as an entrenched and extreme inequality of circumstance was an impediment to this larger and more inclusive goal. But a rigid equality of outcome or of circumstance was never, in the eyes of these 19th century thinkers, the main goal of the progressives. Now, going back to my mention last week of the theorists of justice, like Rawls, you could say that what they have largely produced is a system of thought which combines an egalitarian profession of faith in the principles of redistribution, for which Rawls and others argued, with an institutional skepticism or agnosticism. They have little or nothing to say about the transformation of structure. They have a great deal to say about the redistribution that can correct what the established structure has produced after the fact. After the market has done its magic of creating wealth, the redistributors come and they turn it around. They correct the consequences. They say, the market is a magician of creation of wealth, of novelty. Now we have to put a human face on it. And in practice, what they produced intellectually was a justification of the very practical policies of compensatory redistribution under institutionally conservative social democracy. So in the combination of these two elements, egalitarian commitments and institutional conservatism or skepticism, the second element cuts the first element down to size. The egalitarian commitment seems radical at first, but what results after it has been subject to this skeptical or agnostic reduction is very little. What results is what you see around you. The struggle for some level of decommodification, the humanization of the market order by compensatory and retrospective redistribution, and so on. That way of understanding the ideological dispute in the contemporary world does not seem to be very revealing. It does not seem to show what the progressives or their conservative enemies really want. It seems to be a misinterpretation of the conventional debate. Now, suppose we say that the aim of the progressives rather than being deep equality, is deep freedom. What would that mean? That's what would in some way resonate with this idea that a moment ago I attributed to Karl Marx, to John Stuart Mill, to Abraham Lincoln, to the 19th century, to this idea of the elevation of the ordinary man and woman, to a higher form of life, with more scope, with more capability, with more intensity, and the war against equality only as accessory to this larger campaign. The real aim, you could say, is the greatness of the ordinary human being and the creation of a social world which allows for a higher form of agency. What it really wants is greatness, provided that we can all become great together. Now that leads then to the next point in the argument. Which is the elucidation of this idea of agency or greatness or of empowerment, its philosophical content, before I turn in the second part of the discussion in today's class to its practical manifestation in the struggle against inequality. What does it mean to be free? So you could say, taking a modernist position, it has to do with a series of contradictions in three domains. First, the domain of the self and the other. Now, I'm not speaking about practical politics or particular context. I'm trying to carry the discussion to the most general and abstract philosophical level. Existentially, where and when and how do we become free? First, in the relation of the self to the other. Jean-Paul Sartre says the others are hell. The others are the threat to my freedom. How can I become free? I become free to the extent that I create relations in which the other's existence does not deny my own existence, my own sentiment of being. In my relation to the other, I find my own existence reaffirmed. That would be the first dimension of freedom. And where is it that we have this experience of encountering the other as a reaffirmation of me? Above all, in personal love. But personal love does not flourish outside the sphere of intimacy. We were commanded by Christ to love the stranger. But when he commanded us to do that, he seemed to be commanding us to do something that is impossible. How can we love the stranger? We cannot love the stranger. And if we cannot love the stranger, how can we have in the real life of society this experience of encountering the other as the reaffirmation of me? The moral philosophers, responding to the impossibility of following the command of Christ, give us the cold shoulder of an impersonal and altruistic benevolence. As the sorry substitute for what we cannot have. So there must be a surrogate, a counterpart to the love that we cannot have among strangers, to produce a form of connection in which the other is not the enemy. The surrogate has been cooperation. Cooperation is the feasible counterpart to the unfeasible, to the impossible command to love the stranger. And the practical forms of cooperation that are primary in the life of society, of the modern societies, have been the market and democracy. But all the practical forms of cooperation are objects of dispute. Which form of the market? Which form of democracy? And that interminable dispute fills history up. So if we could find a form of life that allowed us to have this experience in which the other reinforces us, and to have it in life among strangers, we would have our first formative experience of freedom. Now, the second context, the second domain in which we encounter the problem of freedom is the relation of the individual agent to society. No one is free alone. No one is free in the ocean or in the desert. To be free, we have to engage a real social world. But it seems that every engagement in a social world demands from us, as the price of engagement, our surrender to that world. And then we are not free. If we have to choose between being isolated and surrendering to society, we are not free. So somehow we must be able to participate in a social world without surrendering to it. Keeping the last word for ourselves. Engaging and resisting at the same time. And being, in the Christian metaphor, in the world without being of it. So that we can be insiders and outsiders at the same time. So that we can participate while continuing to resist. Then we would be free. And that's the second main domain in which the problem of freedom presents itself. Now, society, for its part, can be organized so as to allow us more easily or not to conquer that freedom. Society can be organized so as to extend the distance between the ordinary moves that we make within a context of assumptions and arrangements that we take for granted, and criticizing or revising those arrangements while we obey them. Those two classes of moves, the moves we make within a framework of arrangements or assumptions that we take for granted, and the moves by which from time to time we challenge and change pieces of those arrangements, can be more or less distant from each other. And the closer they are, the freer we are in this sense. Society and culture can be organized so as to make it harder or easier for us to engage without surrendering. And that is the second domain in which we play out this drama of the struggle for freedom. Now, the third domain in which the struggle goes on lies in the relation of the self to itself. To be free, we must form a coherent way of being in the world. The Greeks called it a character, and they said, character is fate. But if we form this character, this habitual way of action and a vision, it can also not just make us coherent and capable of coherent action and expression, but suck the life out of us like a vampire. So to be free, we must be able to form a habitual pattern of action and vision, but at the same time, somehow to disrupt it. If it becomes an icon, a fetish, replacing the living human being, the experience of life, which is an experience of fecundity, but also of surprise and disruption, we are not free. And society can play a role in making it harder or easier for us to achieve that goal. Now, it seems to me that for us, with our modernist sensibility, any conception of freedom or greatness, because greatness is simply the expression of freedom, of the free human being, its agency, the enhancement of agency, the power of life, of creation, turning the tables against fate. This is the real objective of the progressives. And this leads then, this prompts us to move in the direction of another interpretation of the division between the right and the left. Who are the leftists? Or how should we interpret them? They are distinguished from their conservative adversaries, according to this view, by a practice or a method and by a goal. The conservatives, the right, are the ones who say the established arrangements and assumptions are the horizon within which we must pursue our interests and ideals. To not accept that horizon as what it is a romantic diversion, a failure of courage to face reality. It is what it is. The most important attribute of the world is that it is what it is rather than something else. We cannot infer its attributes from some rational conception, as metaphysical rationalism wants us to do. It is what it is. And the leftist, the progressive on this view, is the one who says, we can only realize our interests and ideals by transgressing the boundaries of the present structure in some way. And when we transgress those boundaries, or to the extent that we transgress them, we will be led then to reinterpret our interests and ideals. We will discover ambiguities in them which were previously hidden from us. Now, this may seem very theoretical, but in fact, it's very practical. There are always multiple ways of understanding, of defining a collective interest, a class interest, the interest of a segment of the workforce. So, for example, to take a very familiar example, and the example which is in fact of greatest historical importance in the evolution of social democracy. In declining industry, in a decaying Fordist mass production industry, the workers and their leaders have two ways of defining their interests. One way is to dig into the niche in the division of labor and say, our interest is to preserve this world as much as we can and for as long as we can, against all our enemies, our class enemies, which are typically the groups closest in social space to us now, against the temporary workers who are threats to the stability of our jobs, against the foreign workers, and so forth. Or they can say, our interest is to convert this conventional industry, this Rust Belt industry, into something else, into a version of the knowledge economy. And we can do that only by allying ourselves with the groups that we were previously inclined to define as our enemies, including the petty bourgeoisie, the small business class, the temporary workers, the foreign workers. We have to form an alliance. So a class interest or an objective interest of a segment of the labor force can typically be defended and defined either in ways that are institutionally conservative and socially exclusive, or in ways that are individually transformative and socially solidaristic. Now let me interject a remark that has no immediate consequence for the argument I'm having at this moment, but that has consequence for the arguments we'll be having later on in the course. The view of collective agency that I've just stated is the direct opposite of the Marxist view. It's not just different, it's the opposite. Because the Marxist view is that Class interests have an objective content. The greater the intensity and the scope of class conflict, the more patent the content of these interests becomes. You discover what the objective content of the interests of the workers is as class conflict intensifies. And the punishment for making a mistake about the content of the class interest is political defeat. The view that I've just stated is the opposite in the following sense. It says, the wider the scope and the greater the intensity of conflict among classes or groups in society, the harder it becomes to distinguish the answer to the question, what are my interests as the member of a certain class, from the question, what would be my interests in a reconstructed world? And then the question, what are my interests, becomes inseparable from the question, what are the adjacent possibilities? Not the remote possibilities, not the theoretical possibilities, but my possibilities in the domain of the adjacent possible. So the progressives would be distinguished on this view from the conservatives by their transformative practice and by their refusal to accept an antecedent dogmatic view of the interests of different groups or classes. Because everything depends on the transformation of the assumptions. They could not have institutional or programmatic dogmas because their projects would always have to be relative to the paths of possible transformation. Now, in the 19th century, the progressives, each sect of the progressives had its dogmatic project. So they recognized the primacy of structural or institutional change over non-structural or non-institutional change. But each group of the progressives said, this is my dogma. So John Stuart Mill said, here is the system of private rights, of the rights of property and contract, of collective self-determination under democracy. Follow my dogma and you will become both rich and free. And each segment of the socialists and communists had similar dogmas and were equally dogmatic. Now we find ourselves in a situation without historical precedent in the history of politics and in the history of thought. We have reason to recognize the primacy of structural change over non-structural change, but we have reason to resist succumbing to a structural dogmatism as the 19th century liberals and socialists did. We must be radical experimentalists rather than dogmatists. And we must take the question of the objective content of group interests and class interests as an open question relative to these possibilities that we create or not. So that's the method. Now obviously this method, as I've described it, as I've described its assumptions so far, is incompatible with the idea that structural change is always wholesale change. that there are these systems of which capitalism would be one, and that they either don't change or change all at once, so that there's a binary idea of politics. Politics is always either reformist or revolutionary. Either it's the management of a system or it's the substitution of one system by another. The practice that would distinguish the progressives from the conservatives would be a practice emphasizing the primacy of structural change, but not in the form of this binary idea of politics. And not in a way that's compatible with the idea of these closed systems. That's one level of the distinction between right and left that emerges from this discussion. The other level has to do with the goal rather than with the practice. What do the conservatives think, really? They think that it is natural for human life to be small. Life is a long littleness, inevitably and naturally for the majority. There is an elite of disruptors, of inventors, of geniuses, of artists who are exempt thanks to the superiority of their talent or their heroic efforts from the decree of belittlement which descends on the rest of humanity. And the philosophers of their philosophers emphasize always this contrast between the disruptor and the herd, ordinary humanity. The goal of the progressives has to be that we can all become greater. We can have this intensification of life, provided that we have it together. It's the opposite of the conservative view. And that's how we would begin to reconstruct the understanding of the contest between right and left. But of course, there's an enormous distance between these abstractions and the reality of action and struggle in a real society. And it's that distance that we somehow have to traverse in the argument of this course. So let me stop there, and with that conclude the first part of the class. And now I want to insist on you saying something. Yes. Can you speak louder and turn on your mic? And here's an alternative. It may work better than the built-in mic.
We're talking about transgression, or at least like hope for a new type of like world or something, as inherently like a leftist dogma or like impulse, right? Can it be that transgression or like the hope for like a new type of world that's not particularly like moral or like breaking previous norms and stuff is not necessarily like leftist? Like for example, like Nietzsche was talking about breaking, I don't know, like morality being like sort of like a subversive thing that we need to like get rid of, that sort of like stuff. Like, can it not be co-opted by groups that speaks the language of like revolution, but like sort of directs it towards like a far more reactionary end?
And what's your main point or question?
is transgression necessarily like like hope for like a new type of world necessarily like divided between like leftist and like right-wing impulse, or can it not be kind of like more murky?
Well, transgression can have to do with either of the parts of this revolutionary program, right? It seems that what you were just alluding to was the personalist side. And there's this relative division between the personalist and the political. But I don't take it too seriously because I think that they're all connected. But the same question arises in the personalist side. So we here are now going to discuss the transformation of the economy, of democracy, of the collective project. There's a parallel debate happening on the personalist side of the revolutionary agenda. There are two main practical ethics now established in the world. There is an ethic of self-fashioning and nonconformity, which is anchored in one of the great superpowers of the contemporary world. Its philosophers, which exaggerated it and limited it, were people like Nietzsche and Emerson. But the characteristics which it accumulated by virtue of its association with a superpower are like the dust of history. They don't make it more powerful, they make it less powerful. And if we wanted to form that ethic, to revise that ethic, so there would be a worthier adversary or a worthier contestant, we would have to lift the dust of history, clean the dust of history from it. The other ethic is an ethic of responsibility and connection. And it is anchored in the other superpower, in China. And it has a history, but its history is from long ago. Its canonical form is over 2,000 years old in classical Confucianism. And it's the same thing applies. Its most obvious defects are the defects that it acquired by virtue of its association with the culture with which it was connected. And we would have to lift that off. And there's a struggle then between these ethics. I don't think they're capable of being synthesized, in fact, but I think both of them are capable of being very much improved. And that's a struggle which would go on in parallel to this debate that I'm proposing to have over the economic and political forms. Because I want that revolutionary project to continue. And to continue, the fire has to continue. This revolutionary fire in its two forms, the political and the personal. The whole object in the world now in this counter-revolutionary moment, interlude, seems to be the opposite, right? Stability. Put the fire off. Turn it off. Smother it. I want it to go on. And I think that's what the progressives have to want, if they're not to become conservatives. Now, if you take this distinction between right and left that I propose, it might seem that almost no one is a progressive, because the historical social democrats, the institutionally conservative social democrats, and the social liberals, the flexibilized form of social democracy that came after it, is much more closely and accurately described under the label of the conservatives in this distinction than of the progressives. So who are the progressives? Are they just the saving remnant? A few anomalies? It's just a proposal for the reconfiguration of our imaginative view of politics. But it's a proposal that has, right at the outset, an immediate problem. That half of the world that it invokes seems barely to exist. Yes.
So I have a couple of interconnect. When you talk about coming in piecemeal and
Can you
not,
speak louder?
so
The
can you
best
hear me
way
now?
to speak, given these circumstances here, is to shout.
Can you hear me now? Is this better?
The natural voice is better than the microphone, but only if it's very loud.
Hello. Can you hear me? Is this better?
It's gotten worse rather than better.
Is this better? Yeah, we need change in the school as well.
So just talk loud.
Can you hear me? Is this better?
Yes, it's better.
Oh, okay. No, I was asking, like, this is a continuation from my question from the last class about you were talking about revolution coming in piecemeal. I also wanted to ask you, do you mean that it often always has to come from the masses? Does there has to be an overall governing body for a revolution? Because when you talk about revolution
No.
in piecemeal,
I'm not talking about a concrete process in any one country, right? It's obvious.
yeah.
I'm talking about this impulse, which has consumed the world now for 3 centuries. I mean, there was earlier in history a period of religious revolutions, which is sometimes called the Axial Age, from the rise of the Jewish prophets to the prophetic activity of Muhammad, and in the middle, about a 1,000-year period. And it produced the world religions that we have today, including what we don't even recognize, may not even recognize as religions, like Confucianism and Buddhism. But it had revolutionary impact. It led, in all the major civilizations of the world, it led what seemed to be the natural ethic, which was the ethic of self-assertion, of the warrior class, to be rejected in favor of the opposite, of universal fellow feeling and empathy. It's astonishing. But that was in the spiritual realm. Now for the last 3 centuries, we've had a practical revolution associated with the complete transformation of the political and economic circumstances of humanity. And that's the thing that we're now discussing, what direction it will have in the future. That's the world historical context that it now has. And what do you then say about it? What were you going to say?
My question was more if and when it comes in piecemeal, there would be one class which might get just enough to not need to keep changing anymore.
Not need what?
There would be, like, when revolution comes in piecemeals, there would be one class which would have just enough to not change anymore, which would, like, maybe would become the reason to not keep proceeding in that direction again.
Yeah.
Which is when I was asking, should there be a larger body which keeps it going, or should it come from internal masses? But when a mass gets enough to
But
not
the
keep
revolutionary
changing.
impulse is not associated with typically in history, with the poorest class. It's not extreme misery which promotes revolution. Extreme misery promotes submission most of the time. The typical agent of revolutions, both spiritual and practical, have been groups that are ascending and have high hopes, but not ascending fast enough. So I claimed that today, in today's world, the class, the group of people that have the strongest claim to be taken as the promoters of the universal interests of humanity, which is what Marx thought the industrial proletariat will be, or what I call the subjective petty bourgeoisie. They're not members of a small business class. The small business class is a minority in every country in the world, but they want to be. They're these wannabe petty bourgeois. That's the majority of humanity. The left regarded them as the enemy in the 20th century, and they became, in time, the mainstay of the fascist and Nazi movements of the extreme right. But so if there's an agent in the world, that's the most important agent. But in the class societies of the contemporary world, they can't act alone. They have to have allies in the elites. So in most countries in the world, the elites are composed of rentiers, financial rentiers or natural resource rentiers. So for there to be productive trouble in the world, there has to be a rupture in the elites. And there has to arise within the country a productivist counter-elite that opposes the rentiers, that seeks power, that wins power, and that in power offers the majority, which is the subjective petty bourgeoisie, alternatives to its default dream of isolated, archaic, retrograde family business. That's a different picture of the possibilities. But part of the debate about the alternatives in the world is a debate about who is the agent, as you correctly suggest. Yes.
I'll just shout. I wanted to ask, this is kind of a two-part question. I wanted to ask about kind of the mechanics of the need for the left to orient, or the new left, as you imagine, to orient itself and fix these causes of disorientation. When we can't conceive of that until we've transcended the terms of the formerly unforeseeable area. And also, I mean, I was thinking maybe it just has a general outline to everyone because, as you say, the general causes of discontent are the same. And this kind of fits into my greater question about how we can reconcile the fragmentary nature of revolution with the kind of need for universalizing heresy.
But what's the question then?
Like how we can reconcile the fragmentary approach to change with the need for this universalized.
Because all the changes that we're going to be exploring and discussing are changes that I think have steps or pieces. They're not all at once changes. If I describe a trajectory of change and I take it in the speculative future to its most radical working out, you can see how could we ever get there? But with respect to every possible change, there's steps that lead there. That's the nature of change. So every fragmentary change, every partial change is ambiguous. Every step taken can be a step toward the next step, or it can be a way not to take the next step. That's the ambiguity of politics. The meaning of every political move is determined by the next thing that happens. It doesn't have a permanent intrinsic meaning. So for example, we're going to be discussing the question of how or under what conditions the knowledge economy as we have it now, multi-sectoral but insular, and therefore a knowledge economy for the few, could become a knowledge economy for the many. And it's not only by a process of many different steps, and the process would begin small. It always begins small. And the question is not how long are any of the steps that we take, but what direction do they go in? So it could seem either just reformist or revolutionary, depending on where you look at it. Remember in the first class I said, I spoke about this dilemma of discourse. I propose something distant. You say it's interesting, it's utopian. I propose something close, you say it's trivial. And I argued that programmatic thought is like music and not like architecture. It's not about blueprints, it's about trajectories. It's about a succession of steps. And every programmatic proposal exists in two different idioms. It's a proposal about change of the arrangements, and it's a proposal about redefinition of the interests and identities of different groups and classes. Yes.
I'll also just yell. Professor, can you give me a bit more of a sense of your conception of greatness, and perhaps even dive into any examples from even today's society? I know you mentioned some examples from the past.
Yeah, so that will bring me directly to the second part of the class.
That's what you want me to do.
Yeah, it feeds directly into what I want to say. Next. So now let's put aside this philosophical discussion for the moment and turn to the question of what's the correct way of thinking about equality in a vision that, like this one that I've outlined, doesn't treat equality as a supreme objective, but a secondary objective of the progressives. And it also leads to radical ideas, but they're different kinds of ideas. So I would say that there are three propositions in a hierarchical order. The first proposition is that structural change in the institutional arrangements and assumptions, always trumps non-structural change. Now, what is structural change for the purposes of this argument right now about equality? Structural change is change reshaping the primary distribution of advantage, as distinguished from change creating a secondary or corrected distribution of advantage. So the way we think about retrospective redistribution through tax and transfer is the market, as it's now organized, produces a certain distribution. Then we come later on, the government comes, or the progressives in power come, and they redistribute, they correct what the market has done. They create a secondary distribution. And what I'm saying now, what I want to argue, is that the secondary distribution doesn't hold a candle to the primary distribution. The secondary distribution is always very limited in what it can accomplish. So the idea of historical social democracy is, it doesn't matter what the market does, because we'll come afterwards and we'll change what it's done by redistributing under Rawls's principles, for example, of redistributive justice. And in practice, it always turns out that what we can do by way of creating the secondary distribution matters very little in comparison to the primary distribution. Now let me give you an example from one of the main debates of the contemporary world, one of the main programmatic debates that I want to put at the center of our arguments in the course, the debate about the future of the market economy. So the market economy is shaped, the knowledge economy. The knowledge economy is shaped in the long term by the regime of property and by the evolution of technology. Now, for the moment, put away the question about property, which has many ramifications, and just focus on technology. So, does technology have an intrinsic logic of evolution? It's a question that would concern a progressive interested in disrupting entrenched inequality. Now, first of all, how should we think about technology? We shouldn't think of it in a physicalist, fetishized form, as a series of gadgets. So, one way of thinking about technology is the materialization of a channel between our experiments in mobilizing the forces of nature in our favor, the electrical force, the magnetic force, the nuclear force, and so forth, and our experiments in reorganizing how we cooperate and work, the technical division of labor. That connection is what we mean by technology. That's what technology is. Another way of thinking about technology is technology marks the movable frontier between what we have learned how to repeat and what we have not yet learned how to repeat. Everything that we've learned how to repeat, we can express in a formula or an algorithm, and then we can embody the formula or the algorithm in the mechanical device. From this standpoint, the point of the machine is to do for us what we have already learned how to repeat, so that we can preserve our supreme and, in a sense, our only resource, our time, for the not yet repeatable. That's another way of thinking about technology. Now, from that standpoint, you could say, the knowledge economy has no intrinsic logic of the technologies of the knowledge economy have no intrinsic evolutionary logic. They have the logic of evolution that we give them. So the established logic of evolution of the technologies of the knowledge economy, culminating in artificial intelligence, has the following characteristics, or the following steps. It says, we will generate technologies that can be internalized in the largest firms that run the most encompassing networks or platforms, and that have the greatest amount of capital, which allows them to pay for the development of these technologies and to internalize them. Second, in the midterm, the main goal of technological evolution will be automation, the substitution of human labor by the machine. And the ultimate goal, the distant goal, will be general artificial intelligence, by which we mean the machine that is a simulacrum of the human mind. The closer the machine is to the human mind, the more like it is to the human mind, the more successful we can regard ourselves. The ideal machine in the future would be the one that is just our mind, reorganized as a machine. Now imagine an alternative trajectory of technological evolution, an alternative logic of technological evolution. It would say, In the first stage, the main addressees, the main beneficiaries of the machines that we create in the knowledge economy should be, on one side, the small and medium-sized firms of the backward peripheral economy, and on the other side, the mass of individualized economic agents, the so-called informal workers or irregular workers, the precarious workers, who are now a major part of the labor force in every country in the world. And the technology that we will have to create for them to use according to their limited and movable capacity of assimilation will not be less sophisticated than the technologies we would create for the big platforms. They will be more sophisticated. In the medium term, the objective commanding our efforts will not be automation. It will not be the substitution of human labor. It will be the equipment of human labor. We will want to equip and empower the worker, not to replace the worker. And in the long term, the commanding goal will not be general artificial intelligence. It will be a machine that is as different as possible from the human mind, so that we can make use of it, so that we can collaborate. It will have powers, computational powers, which will vastly exceed our own, but it will not have imagination. And our goal in the long run will be to create an association, a partnership between the machine and the anti-machine. The anti-machine is the human being. That's a directly opposite logic of evolution, of technological evolution, influencing the primary distribution of advantage. It's not creating a secondary distribution. It's not something that we organize in the sphere of redistribution. It's something that we organize in the sphere of production. One of the notable characteristics of the contemporary progressives is that on the whole they lack ideas about production. They have no program for the supply side of the economy. They only have a program for the demand side of the economy. And thus they, as it were, concede defeat before the struggle has even started. So the aim should be, that's the first principle, which I'm exemplifying now with respect to technology. I could exemplify with respect to property, but that's a more complicated discussion, even more complicated than this one. So that's the first principle. Everything that has to do with production and the structure with institutions, the institutions of the economy and this form of production, trumps everything that is designed merely to create a secondary distribution that corrects the primary distribution. Now, be clear about what's the basic intuition at the heart of this notion that the primary distribution trumps the corrected or secondary distribution. The economy is organized according to certain arrangements and incentives. Can you come later after the fact and say, it doesn't matter what is produced, how it's benefited some classes or hurt other classes? We'll correct it. So we'll cancel it. We'll call and say, that doesn't count. We'll make something completely different later. It doesn't work that way. What can be, because you can't organize the economy to operate in a certain way and then say, we'll now, after the fact, create a distribution which will undo all the distribution the market has done. Obviously, you can only do that in some accessory way. It can never amount to anything more than a modest marginal correction or humanization of the operation of the market. It can never substitute for what the market has actually done. So that's the first principle. Now, conceding that principle doesn't mean that the progressive has to abandon the idea of corrective redistribution altogether. So now the second proposition in the hierarchy of propositions is that when you come to this correction in a secondary distribution, it is vital to look at both sides of the equation, not just the progressive profile of taxation, but also the profile of governmental spending and the tax take. And the proposition is this: in the middle term, what matters with respect to egalitarian redistribution is not the progressive profile of taxation. It is the aggregate level of the tax take and how it is spent. So this is a response to the greatest enigma of comparative experience in taxation and in fiscal matters. What is the greatest enigma? The greatest enigma is that the most unequal industrial democracy in the North Atlantic world by far organizes its tax system, giving pride of place to the progressive taxation of income, the income tax. The much more egalitarian European social democracies organize their tax systems around the avowedly regressive taxation of consumption through the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax or some functional equivalent to it as exists in France. Now, what is the explanation of this enigma? The explanation of this enigma is relatively simple, but at the same time surprising. So, first of all, understand what is the flat rate value-added tax. Easy to understand in principle, but in practice, rarely completely uniform and comprehensive as it should be. If you imagine the economy as a table like the Leontief tables, mapping the transformation of inputs into outputs, and aggregating value at each stage of this transformation, the value-added tax takes a constant amount of the transformation of every input into an output. And in principle, conceptually, if it is completely comprehensive and neutral, it is the most neutral tax with respect to the system of relative prices, and therefore the one that is least likely to create economic trauma proportional to the revenue that it can raise for the state. So the comprehensive flat rate value-added tax maximizes the tax take while minimizing the economic trauma of taxation under the current market system. It therefore allows the Europeans to take in at least 10% of GDP more than the Americans, and then to spend it redistributively in the investment in people and their capabilities, in health and in education. And everything that they have lost by way of progressivity on the revenue-raising side of the tax system, they gain in double on the spending side. That's the answer to the enigma. That's the basic mystery of the thing. Now, why then do the American politicians at election time all profess to be friends of the progressive taxation of income? Apparently, because that's the way they have of showing on whose side they are. But they know, or they should know, in fact, I think many of them do know, that this progressive taxation has a completely marginal effect on the on the structure of inequality in the United States. So that's the second proposition. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have direct taxation and that direct taxation can't also be redistributive. So the third proposition is that direct redistributive taxation in principle has two targets. One target is the hierarchy of standards of living. And the second target is the exercise of economic power by the control of capital. The second target is much harder to reach than the first target. And the best way by far to reach the second target, the use of capital as an instrument of economic power, is at the moment of death, or the anticipation of death and of the hereditary transmission of property through gifts inter vivos in the family. But it's a much less satisfactory way of reaching the target of economic power than would be reorganization of the economy and of the relations between labor and capital. The other target, what I said is the first target, is the hierarchy of standards of living. And there is a very easy way to reach that through a tax on consumption. It was the Kaldor tax, initially theorized by Nicholas Kaldor, a disciple of Keynes, in his book on the expenditure tax, published in 1955. What the Kaldor tax does is it takes a constant amount, it subtracts from the total income of the individual, both capital income and labor income, his invested savings. That difference is what he spends on himself, on his standard of living. Everything that he doesn't spend on himself, on his standard of living, becomes economic power, the other problem. The income tax is a confused and blunt instrument which reaches neither of these targets clearly. And in practice, it is a tax on the salaries of the middle classes. Rich people, in principle, don't pay the income tax. So it's a crazy tax. It's a tax that doesn't make sense, but it's a tax that's widely favored in the contemporary societies. This is what you would do if you were clear-sighted about equality in the tax system and you thought this is secondary, because the real thing is structure. The real thing is the primary distribution, not the secondary distribution, but I'm going to show that I care about it anyway. It's a very easy tax to administer. It's a declaratory tax. Its difficulties are exactly the same as the difficulties of the income tax. But it has over the income tax, among other virtues, the advantage of not being limited to any particular high rate. The rate can be as high as you want. It depends only on political will and power. So if you're consequential about your redistributivist intentions, you can have at the top a rate of multiples of 100%. You can say, at the lowest level of spending, an individual pays to the state nothing. He receives something. That's what the Americans call the negative income tax. Then the rate increases steeply as the level of spending and the hierarchy of consumption goes up. And at the top, with luxury living, the sky's the limit. You can say you pay 400% is the rate. For every dollar you spend, you pay 4 to the state. There's no objection to that, and there's no practical difficulty, because whatever you don't demonstrate as invested saving counts as if it were spent, and then you tax it. So it's a great tax. And if you were logical, that's what you would adopt for the entirely secondary, tertiary goal of redistributive egalitarianism. So the program of social democracy, which is tax justice in its current form, doesn't make sense. It makes sense only to the extent that my second proposition describes, to do as the European social democracies do, to say that with respect to compensatory redistribution, we're not trying to create equality. We are investing in people and in their capabilities, in their health, in their physical security, in their education, and we will create equality obliquely by this investment in people and their capabilities. And the way we'll do it is to not to tax income differentially, which is, as I said, just a tax on the middle classes, but to tax consumption and the hierarchy of standards of living. I think this is an argument that the only way to lose this argument is if you don't have the argument. But that's what happens in these societies. So now I've concluded the second part of my disquisition. And now have I provoked you to speak? Does everyone understand what a Caldor tax is, how it works? Just an income tax. But it also taxes, it takes together income from capital and income from labor. It subtracts what you spend on yourself and take out of the pool of the resources of society. It says that difference, that's one of the two principal differences that money makes. It affects the way people live. So let's attack that directly. Let's not attack it obliquely as we do through the income tax. Let's attack it directly. And if we have enough political power and enough political will, we can radicalize the consumption tax, as I suggested, because it has no limit at the top. It's just a question of power. There's no administrative difficulty. It's a declaratory tax with no problems other than the problem of the income tax. If you can administer an income tax, you can administer an expenditure tax, because there's no difference, there's no additional difficulty of administration. Now, what would limit your enthusiasm would not be the difficulty of administration of the tax. It would be realizing that all of that is secondary anyway compared to the organization of the structure of production, which is what really matters, the primary distribution of advantage and opportunity, not the secondary corrected distribution. But we don't even have that level of clarity. So I agree that there's a paradoxical element, a certain element of subtlety. It's saying that a system that relies on an avowedly regressive tax, like the value-added tax, could, in its overall impact, be more progressive than a system that is directly devoted to direct progressive taxation of income. But I don't think it's so complicated that you couldn't explain it to the people in a few minutes. It's not so subtle. It's strange, it's surprising, but it can be easily explained. And certainly politics in a democracy has a pedagogic element. A leader should be a teacher. She should explain things. So why don't they explain it, these hypocrites? And a lot of them know that what they're doing has a completely marginal effect on redistribution. But they do it anyway. As I say, apparently to show whose side they're on. Am I missing something in my argument about that, on that point? Yes.
I think for me, my question is, where do you see the role of somebody like yourself as an intellectual, as somebody who's able to present these ideas to policymakers, right? I mean, I wonder how you see your role as somebody who has these ideas that are relatively easy to understand. But then there's clearly a disconnect. So I mean, I wonder if it has to do with
Yes.
what
So
you're doing.
let me respond to your question with the question: how do you think I should see my role?
I mean, I'm not sure. I think if you haven't already, you probably have. I think you probably have talked to people who are able to make this change, right?
So this is a much larger question, right? This is the question of thought and politics. Hegel said, the only remaining tragedy in bourgeois life is the impossibility of combining a life of thought with a life of action. I think he was mistaken, because I think it's not impossible. I think it is possible, it's just difficult, and it depends on luck. But I think that in principle, you can combine engagement with thinking. But not at the same time, because politics and philosophy, taking philosophy as thought in its most general ambition, and politics as transformation, these are the only two human activities which are not about something, they're about everything, both of them. And as they are about everything, they also demand everything. They demand complete mobilization of the emotions, of attention, of intensity. And that's one of the reasons why they're so difficult to combine. But they can be combined. Now, the philosophers have forever in the West suffered from a problem in the combination of politics and philosophy. They have been attracted to the shortcut. The philosopher is anxious about his time. He knows he's going to die. He's anxious to get back to his writing, to finish, to conclude his thought. And so he looks for a shortcut. The shortcut that has existed since Plato is that the philosopher finds a prince into whose ears he can whisper. And he thinks that if he whispers into the ears of the prince, he can rush back to his books and preserve his time for what really matters, which is philosophy. It doesn't work. It's never worked. Plato was thrown in prison, and ever since then, these attempts, these Jesuitical attempts of the philosopher to act through the power holders who are their friends, have been a huge flop. That's the situation. So I think that the individual. Now this leads to another question. This is certainly an unexpected turn in the discussion, but I welcome it. This leads to another question. The individual can't act as if he were the instrument instrument of the collective interest of humanity, right? The individual dehumanizes himself if he thinks of himself as just a means to an end, an instrument. So the individual has to have some moral interest in this operation. So whispering into the ears of the prince is not enough. The shortcut doesn't work. The philosopher, if he can, has to expose himself. He has to do what we all have to do. We have to throw down our shields, and we have to become vulnerable. So the philosopher can serve the universal interests of society and exert his pedagogic function on a wider scale only if it has a moral interest for him and puts him in a situation in which he becomes vulnerable and subjects him to forms of danger and threat and inconvenience to which he would not otherwise be subject. So I recommend that to anyone who's willing to try it out. But I would say, let me mention another comment. Robert Musil, who wrote The Man Without Qualities, one of the great novels of modern literature, said, philosophers are despots without armies. So they all have this idea that they know the salvation of humanity, and but they're missing an army with which to execute it. So then they try and find the army. But you get more or less the sense of my answers? I think that you could say, well, you have an obligation to be pedagogic. People write books and no one reads them, right? Schopenhauer said, the purchase of books is commonly mistaken for the acquisition of their contents. So you write a book, you spend 10 years writing a work, and you think, well, make a huge impact. It doesn't make any impact. It's like David Hume said, you threw it down a well, and it didn't even excite a murmur from the zealots. So that's the way it is. So you're deluded. I wrote things, and I made fun of myself. I wrote a preface to one of these things many years later. I said, in such and such a year, I published this book, and nothing happened. Well, that's the universal experience of authorship. So that's the situation. But I recommend the activity of trying to do things, even though they don't have resonance, and even though they lead to trouble. And I will tell you very frankly, that was my experience. When I started teaching, initially people attacked my work, and I got very upset. Then some years passed, and they would continue attacking my work, but I no longer got upset. I felt, well, I'm in trouble. Because it's as if I were wearing a coat of armor that no arrow could penetrate. So I got involved in the politics of my country, because that was the way of ripping the coat of armor off. But I didn't do it because I thought it would be pedagogic, because it was my duty to enlighten and lead the people. It was an attempt in that direction, but it had an immediate moral interest for me. It took me out of the garden here, in which nothing could happen to me, and it put me in a situation in which lots could happen to me. So I think that the discovery of the path of connecting thought with philosophy has to go through things like that. You know, we're not playing a role in some drama that someone wrote for the purpose of the moral instruction of humanity. This is life. This is our life. The one and only life that we'll have. None of us is going to get out of here alive. And we have to live life. The condition to live life authentically is to unprotect yourself. So that's what I would put morally first on the list. and not some instrumental service to the interests of humanity. Do you have a comment?
No, I appreciated your answer. And yeah, I think it's interesting to think about it in terms of self-interest.
I wouldn't regard this as self-interest in some narrow sense. I think that, you know, there are two opposing errors that one makes in considering an existential issue like this relation between practice and thought. One is to think of yourself as an ant serving the anthill, serving the community of ants. Your life is an instrument for saving the group, or in this case, enlightening it. That's a dehumanization, which will also always lead to self-deception. The opposing error is a romantic adventurism. So you say, well, I'm going to go into politics because it's going to be a great adventure for me, personally. That's also a form of narcissism. So that can't be right either. But what you have to find is some parallelism between your interest in rescuing your life from routine and the interest of the group in finding a path in the world. This intersection, which again depends on luck, on good fortune, which you can't predict whether it will work out. But what else can you do? I mean, what would you have advised Plato to do? No, don't go to Sicily, because you might get locked up. I would have told him that in hindsight, with the knowledge I acquired through these experiences, don't believe in this practice of finding the tyrant to do your dirty work. Do your dirty work yourself. That's what I would have told him. But I would have also told him that getting in trouble is better than not getting in trouble. So all those things are true. Now make sense of that. Okay, I think this is enough for today. Thank you.
Quickly, just for all the undergrads, can you quickly raise your hands maybe? Who's in the discussion seminar, so just like a quick overview. Did you receive my email yesterday? Yeah? Can you quickly respond after class so we can schedule a course for the coming days? Ideally, we would convene this week already. If you can't make it, then it's okay, but ideally, try to make it. Thank you.
Yeah. And what field are you doing your PhD? A former German student of mine who is now, I forgot his name, Florian, I believe his first name is Florian, who has a small operation connected to MIT on nuclear fusion. Could be. His last name is something like Metzler. You know, yeah. Good.
Like talking about it, like seals, like you can also like sort of transfer social kind of status of them exist in general. And can it actually always be like the lift symbols? Because like the revolution that came in like from Bangladesh came very much from like an impulse to restore back like a very reactionary social order that used to exist. And like then like one can like call it as like sort of like a counter revolution, like in a certain sense, you know, like the revolution is like very reactionary when it comes to like women's progress, like why like it's a very kind of like it isn't like in very much in like a modern right wing backlash that's like sort of
Yes.
that's still like these like how do we kind of like when in these times of like where there's like a lot of stuff like what how do we like people like us were like just a single person help integrate into us like some better aims towards like this impulse of like actually liberating people rather than like
People can have tremendous effect, and individuals can have exemplary effect. One of the things I've learned by my efforts at engagement is that it's easier to change a country than it is to change a person. Because to change a country, you need to be a statesman. Oh, you need to be a statesman. To change a person, you need to be Jesus Christ. That's a higher level. So you have a chance of changing yourself. But you can't change yourself directly by acts of will. You can only change yourself by throwing yourself into a situation in which, as I said here, you unprotect yourself. And unprotection is the road to transformation. Good. No, I don't. I'm teaching every day, so I talk to people after class.